Good morning and welcome to our Sunday Bible study again, or whatever day of the week that you're tuning in and following along. We're going to be looking at our last lesson in Gideon this week. We have one more week in our study of the book of Judges, and we'll talk about what we're going to cover in that lesson at the end. But as you saw on our screen, our lesson is entitled How Quickly from Conqueror to Conquered. And we're going to be looking at Judges chapter 8, verses 18 through 34. Now, we're really going to be looking at Judges 8, verses 10 through 35, and we won't cover all of that in detail, but the reason for that is that there is a gap between what happened in the lesson last week and what is taking place this week. I just want you to have every piece of information there to kind of fill in the gaps and give you that context there. We're going to read that in a moment. As we're going forward, though, there are going to be some questions we want to think about at the end regarding Gideon, and I want you to be thinking about not only the lesson that we're covering today, but then also what we've been looking at over the last several weeks with regard to Gideon. And if you're honest with yourself, you may realize that there are some troubling features here, and troubling in the sense that we want to affirm Gideon in so many ways, but he's making it kind of difficult. And when that happens, we kind of feel bad that we don't do more, because he's a character in the Bible that delivered the people of Israel out of oppression. And yet we have to be honest with ourselves as we're honest with the text and honest with the purposes of the author of the text. So we'll be looking at that as we move forward. As we get ready to begin, though, let me make a couple of comments moving forward. As we said already, we're going to conclude our study of the Gideon cycle this week. And, as we work toward the end, we want to think about what's going on in Israel. We want to think about how God is using Gideon and how that might fit our understanding of who we are in Christ and how we relate to God in the world and around those around us. Before we get started into that, though, let me make a couple of comments. One is a self-correction, and it's more of a clarification than anything. Last week, I mentioned an author of a commentary, and I called him Lawson, and he is named Lawson. But the author of the NIV application commentary on the book of Judges is actually Lawson Younger, Jr., and so I want to get that correct. And I know that you want that to be correct as well. You might have caught that if you're familiar with that author or not, or if you're familiar with that author. But in my attempt to be intellectually honest there, his name is not Lawson. It is Lawson Younger, Jr. We'll bring his name up again here in our lesson for today. One of the things I want you to think about as we read the lesson, though, is that there are some ironies in the text, and I'll highlight a couple of those. But if you are going to be observant with the text and then go back over chapters 6 through 8, you're going to see a number of other ironies in this text. And then also, there are some firsts and some lasts in the book of Judges found in our lesson today as well. And so I want you to be thinking about that, and I'll highlight a couple of those as we go through there. I hope that you are appreciating what the author is doing here from a literary and narrative perspective, because all of it is informing our understanding of the theology as well. And so I think it's going to be valuable to take in all of that. And with that said, we're not even covering everything that could be discussed with regard to this narrative, with regard to things like word plays. I've brought up a couple of those along the way, but I've not touched on those a lot. There are some structural things, the way the story begins and ends, and I've not focused on those a lot. But with that in mind now, what I'd like for you to do is think about going back and reading chapters 6 through 8 in their totality and watch how the text flows in its whole, even as we have spent the last 7 weeks, counting this week, in its various parts. So one of the things I want to do is read to you the text that we're going to be looking at as background, and then we'll come back and look at the cycle and the outline of our text for today. But let me go ahead and give you that background. We're going to be looking at Judges chapter 8, verses 18 through 34, but I do want to read to you specifically verses 10 through 17 now. Last week, what we did is we finished with Gideon's threat to Sukkoth and Penuel, that when he comes back after capturing Zeba and Zalmuna, he will take care of them. Here's what happens with Zeba and Zalmuna. Now, Zeba and Zalmuna were in Conqueror, and with them was their army of about 15,000 men, who were also those left of the army, or of the entire army of the people of the east. Those who had been killed were 120,000 armed men. Gideon traveled on the caravan route east of Noba and Jogbeha and attacked their army while the army felt secure. In other words, he captured them, or he attacked them by surprise. Zeba and Zalmuna fled, and he pursued them. He captured these two kings of Midian and routed the entire army. Gideon, son of Joash, returned from the battle by the ascent of Heres. He captured a youth from the men of Succoth and interrogated him. The youth wrote down for him the names of the 77 leaders and elders of Succoth. Then he went to the men of Succoth and said, "Here are Zeba and Zalmuna. You taunted me about them, saying, 'Are Zeba and Zalmuna now in your power, that we should give bread to your exhausted men?'" So he took the elders of the city, and he took some thorns and briars from the wilderness, and he disciplined the men of Succoth with them. He also tore down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. So we have some context there. We have the threat made to Succoth and Penuel in the process of his pursuing of Zeba and Zalmuna. And now he has followed through with what he has said on two counts. He's captured Zeba and Zalmuna, and now he's also gone back to Succoth and Penuel with Zeba and Zalmuna in hand, literally. And then he carries out the threat that he made against Succoth and Penuel by basically threshing them. He didn't kill them, but he certainly punished them by raking them over with the briars and the thorns, as he had promised. Things that would have been done in separating out some of the wheat, so to speak, when making the wheat and the threshing of the wheat and so forth. Then he goes and takes care of tearing down the tower of Penuel, in which he killed many men there as well. We said last week that one of the things we're seeing with Gideon here is very troubling. He seems to be doing things on his own and not with necessarily God's approval. We'll talk about that as we move forward with what takes place with Zeba and Zalmuna in a moment. But these verses bridge that gap now as we get ready to go into the passage with regard to Zeba and Zalmuna specifically, and then what happens with Israel after this. So what I'd like to do is go ahead and pick up with our outline, and then also talk about the cycle as we bring it into proper perspective. So let's go ahead and look at that. First, the cycle. We see again that the story begins with chapter 6, verse 1, with the people going into sin. Chapter 6, verse B, or 1b through 6a, is the oppression of the Midianites, the Amalekites, known as the people of the East, or peoples of the East, or it could be in addition to the Midianites and the Amalekites. Then the cry for help, very briefly, in verse 6, chapter 6, verse 6b, and then the deliverance. We've been in the deliverance stage for a long, long time. And now what we're going to see finally is the cycle making its way back to the beginning. And I want you to see something there. When we look at this, we are seeing the return to sin, not after Gideon has died, but before he has died, and then further after he has died. And that's why you see sin listed there in chapter 8, verse 27, and also verses 33 through 35. We'll talk about that moving forward, but I think it's very important we recognize that we have now the people returning to sin even before the judge has died. Well, let's look at the text, how quickly from conqueror to conquered, verses 10 through, or excuse me, 18 through 34, but I've included, as you can see in the first point of the outline, verses 10 through 21. We're going to look at verses 18 to 21 in a moment. We're going to see the deaths of Zeba and Zalmuna. Probably could have called that the capture and death of Zeba and Zalmuna. Then we're going to see two different endings, and it's rather interesting that we see this, and I want to point that out as we get there. But the first ending is a recognition of the defeat of Midian for good, with peace in the land, and then Gideon creating an ephod, and what that will mean in terms of the life of the people of Israel, verses 22 through 27. And then we'll conclude with ending number 2, Gideon's death and the aftermath. And we'll look there then at verses 28 through 35. Our lesson goes through verse 34, but we're going to have to cover through verse 35 as well. So let's go ahead and move into the text proper for today. First of all, let's go ahead and read verses 18 to 21. We've already read the fact that Gideon has captured Zeba and Zalmuna, and now there's going to be a reckoning as a result. Here's what takes place in verses 18 through 21. This is Gideon speaking. He asked Zeba and Zalmuna, "What kind of men did you kill at Tabor?" "They were like you," they said. "Each resembled the son of a king." So he said, "They were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had let them live, I would not kill you." Then he said to Jether, his firstborn, "Get up and kill them." Then Jether said, I should say, the youth did not draw his sword. I skipped a line. The youth did not draw his sword, for he was afraid because he was still a youth. So Gideon has told his oldest son, get up and kill them. He's fearful because he's young and wouldn't do it. There's a parallel we're going to see with Gideon earlier in the narrative. Well, verse 21, Zeba and Zalmuna said, "Get up and strike us down yourself, for a man is judged by his strength." So Gideon got up, killed Zeba and Zalmuna, and took the crescent ornaments that were on the necks of their camels. Let's talk through this a little bit. First of all, we see the question that Gideon asks. He says, "What kind of men did you kill?" Two translations actually say something like this. The ESV, the English Standard Version, and the New American Standard Bible 2020 asked this question: where are or where were the men you killed? Now, this is odd, and I don't think we want to spend a lot of time dealing with this kind of difference here, but it is a striking difference. Every other translation that I've looked at, and I haven't looked at all of them, but the great majority of the major translations I've looked at ask the same question as the Christian Standard Bible that I've been reading asks, and that is, what kind of men did you kill? The ESV and the NASB 2020 both ask, where were the men you killed or whom you killed? Now, I don't know why there is that difference. I've tried to see if there was one. There may be a textual difference there. It is interesting that the New American Standard Bible, the 1995, asked the same question as all the other translations, but reverts to, where were the men whom you killed? Interesting. Well, it's clear that what was asked has to do with who they were and what kind they were, because when Zeba and Zalmuna answer, they describe the men as this: they were like you are. Each resembled the son of a king. Some translations will say they resembled princes. Well, ESV again says, as you are, so were they, which we don't talk like that, but it's interesting the way they put that. The comparison then is, they were people just like you, Gideon. And Gideon reveals then what the reason for that resemblance is. He says, you killed my brothers, the sons of my mother. So clearly, a couple things in play. One, we talked about where Gideon was going and what was his motivation last week. It seems that he's gone from being motivated by serving the Lord to now serving himself. We said last lesson also the fact that really once the Midianites, Amalekites, peoples of the East, once the Midianite coalition actually crossed the Jordan River, they're outside the territory. If they could have made it down through Gad and into the southeastern part of the Dead Sea area. However, remember that Gideon called the Ephraimites, and they actually caught them at the pass, made them turn eastward across the Jordan into Gad, which actually prevented them from going further south. Had they let the Midianite coalition go, they would have been out of the way, and victory is still won. And perhaps we look at Gideon in a very positive light. It's very clear, though, that he keeps pursuing, and we see the attitude and action against Sukkoth and Penuel, and now we see the action against Zeba and Zalmuna. We see here that what happens is Gideon is now going to take action, not on the basis of being loyal to Yahweh, but exacting vendetta and vengeance against Zeba and Zalmuna, probably through the hands of the Midianite armies, of course, for doing what they did to his brothers. First, then, is we're seeing his motive change. Second thing is that clearly this action carried out by Zeba and Zalmuna, along with the Midianite armies, against his brothers at Mount Tabor occurred at some point prior to the gathering of the battle that took place against the Midianite coalition when Gideon led the 300. It had to have happened sometime during that 7-year period of oppression when the Midianite coalition would come in and go out, come in and go out. We don't know exactly when. We've never heard of them. This is not told to us in the text prior to this. And so what we're seeing here then is Gideon falling back on personal vengeance. He's got a personal gripe to pick with them. The other thing to note, of course, is now we have the names of the two kings. We were introduced to them last week, but we see them here. And now we're seeing them talk with Gideon. Now, there are a couple of things else that we could say here. One is, in one respect, we do see that by taking Zeba and Zalmuna particularly, what we're seeing then is when you capture the leader, you've definitely defeated the army. And we'll see what takes place in a moment as a result of that. The other thing is that we see Gideon going back to Sukkoth and Penuel after capturing Zeba and Zalmuna. And so he's treating Zeba and Zalmuna as a prize. And he's not really treating them in relationship to who they are as pagan worshipers and as oppressors of the people of Israel. He's now treating them as oppressors of his family. And so we see him taking care of business, if you will. It's interesting that while Gideon is doing this, he's now also using language that sounds very pious. He makes an oath promising, as the Lord lives, as surely as the Lord lives, some translations would say, standard kind of oath, making a word of promise that had they not killed his brothers, he would not kill them. However, the point is they did kill his brothers, and therefore now he's going to have them killed. So we're seeing him acting out of personal vendetta, but trying to couch it in terms of an act of God and acting righteously. I'm doing this on behalf of the Lord, so to speak. It was similar language that he used when he was going through Sukkoth and said, when the Lord hands them over to me, then I will come back and thresh you. Well, the only other time he mentions God at this point now is when he's making an oath to Zeba and Zalmuna, as surely as the Lord lives. And so we're seeing Gideon in a totally different light. And I get it. It seems rather difficult to handle here. We want to be thinking Gideon is acting righteously, but if we're reading the text honestly and we're taking what the author is giving us, it should make us stand back and think what's going on here. That Gideon had the Ephraimite cut the Midianite coalition off at the pass meant that they, of course, stayed in Israelite territory. He didn't let them go. He could have let them go, but he didn't. And then we have an interesting comment here in verse 20 where it says Gideon tells his oldest son Jether to kill them. Now, why doesn't he do it himself? We don't know why he doesn't do it himself. But we do see Jether afraid. And he's young, and it could be that he is kind of like Gideon was when God first called Gideon. He was afraid. He didn't know what to do, and he had asked for a sign and time again. But then we see Zeba and Zalmuna taunt Gideon. I mean, they know that the end is near, and so they're going to get that last word in. But notice what they say. They say, a man is judged by his strength. And why do I stop there? Because you'll remember when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon at first in chapter 6, he said to Gideon that you will be able to capture Midian out of your strength. And so we see a word play there, a repeat of that word. Only here, it's an ironic word play. It's not strength that he's getting from the Lord. He is going to be doing it himself. Notice then the taunting. A man is judged by his strength. We see that echo there then of God's words to Gideon back in chapter 6:14. And then Gideon does kill them. A couple things, well, not necessarily a couple things. One thing I want to mention before we go on to another thing about what happens in the last part of this text. It's interesting that when the angel of the Lord appeared, he does call Gideon mighty warrior. And of course, he is self-deprecating, and he indicates that he's just a guy in his small family. He's the youngest in his family. He's not very much of a warrior at all. But as this battle is carried out, he goes from leading the army of God, simply carrying out God's plan by the pitchers being broken, the torches lit up, and the blowing of the trumpet, causing the Midianite coalition to kill itself and then to retreat. And now he pursues, and he's called other people out of Israel as an army to chase after them. He has strategy in place. it does seem like in many respects, while he may not have been a professional soldier, he very quickly grasped the idea or had some of that latent in him and called upon that to carry it out. What happens then? He does end up working within his own strength and not necessarily with the endorsement of the Lord. The last thing he does then after he kills Zeba and Zalmuna is he takes the crescent ornaments off the camels' necks. Now, the ornaments, this would have been a standard thing on the camels. I'll be honest, I'm not clear on all that this would mean. I do know that what he's doing, however, is collecting plunder. He is collecting the plunder from the Midianite army, and there are going to be some other things that take place in a moment. The other thing is we're seeing the mention of the camels. We don't know how many camels were involved here. We are told at the beginning of the narrative, of course, that the camels were innumerable. They couldn't be counted. And so he's gathering up a lot from these crescent necklaces. Now, it could be that these are the camels only of Zeba and Zalmuna. It could be that they are other camels involved as well. But we're seeing then, again, where we began, we're ending with a reference to the camels. They were mentioned when the Midianite coalition was first identified, and then they were mentioned before the battle took place in the Jezreel Valley, and now they're mentioned again. As I've brought up Gideon at this point and talked about some of his actions, let me ask you this. Have you known leaders who did things for personal gain or out of personal motives, but sought to justify doing them as if doing them for the Lord? In other words, they were using God as a cover. I think if we're honest, we can see many in leadership today. We don't want to call out any names. We certainly don't want to judge motives, but we can look at their fruit. And it seems like there's a lot of acting on one's own benefit or for one's own benefit, but couching it in such language as we're doing this for the Lord. There has been more than one pastor who has done things against a congregation's finances and then saying, this is for the Lord. Well, I don't want to get into too much personal application at this point, but I do think it was fitting right now to think about that. We see Gideon doing things and now putting it in terms of how he's doing this to serve the Lord. It does seem now that he's no longer acting as deliverer of Israel, and he's acting as his own personal vengeance machine, if you will. But we're seeing here acting out of his own will. After this takes place, then we see what the people of Israel do in verses 22 through 27. And so this is ending number one, the peace that follows and the ephod of Gideon. Verse 22, then the Israelites said to Gideon, rule over us, you as well as your sons and your grandsons, for you delivered us from the power of Midian. But Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. Then he said to them, let me make a request of you. Everyone give me an earring from his plunder. Now the enemy had gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And they said, these are the Israelites again, they said, we agree to give them. So they spread out a cloak, and everyone threw an earring from his plunder on it. The weight of the gold earrings he requested was 43 pounds of gold. In addition to the crescent ornaments and ear pendants, the purple garments on the kings of Midian, and the chains on the necks of their camels. So not just the pendants around the camels, but other types of jewelry and all these other elements that the Midianite kings and armies had. Then verse 30 or 27, Gideon made an ephod from all this and put it in Ophrah, his hometown. Then all Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his household. And let's break this down a little bit. Verse 22, Israel makes a request. They say, be a king over us, you, your sons, and even your grandsons. What's interesting about this is we know later in history that the people of Israel are going to ask Samuel, in light of who his sons are, to bring them a king, make them a king, someone that they could follow, will make them like all the other nations. But this is actually the first time in the Old Testament that Israel comes to a leader and says, rule over us. Now, back in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 20 or 14 through 20, we do see Moses, God through Moses, giving provisions and warnings about a king later to come. So it's not unexpected there would be a king, but it was a matter of timing and personnel. And in this case with Gideon, and when you read further Abimelech in chapter 9 and 10, part of chapter 10 in Judges, and then later with Samuel, you'll see that there are some things that take place that are really outside of God's will, and yet God will accommodate them during the time of Samuel. But there are provisions. It's not unexpected. So the point is that they're asking God, or asking Gideon, to be king over them. Gideon does give a very good response, but it's a confusing response. If you think about it, the first thing he says, I'm not going to rule over you, and my son is not going to rule over you. He gives the right answer. The Lord will rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. Is this a sign that Gideon is kind of coming back to his senses about what happened? Maybe after he's gone through and exacted his own personal revenge, he's like, wait a minute, this is really about the Lord. It could be, but it doesn't last, because the next thing he does is that he's going to build an ephod and make an ephod. We'll talk about that in a moment. Our lesson writer, John Durham, in the student guide, says this is the last God-honoring comment that is made by Gideon as recorded in the scriptures. And as I said, it's quickly followed by a very uncomfortable narrative that will lead to the people going astray. So he does put out the word that God will rule over them, and yet it doesn't last very long. In one instance, Gideon sounds like he's on the right track, and then in the next, he makes this strange request of the people. He says, take one golden earring from your plunder and hand it in. And the side note that the author of Judges mentions is that the Ishmaelites had earrings. They had the earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And you might be thinking, why in the world are they called Ishmaelites here if they've been called Midianites? Well, if you go back to Genesis chapter 37, you'll remember that Joseph's brothers were angry with him, and so they were going to kill him. But what they did instead was, when they saw the Midianite traders coming by, or the Ishmaelite traders coming by, they sold Joseph to them. And in that text, they are called both Ishmaelites and Midianites. It is a little bit confusing because Midianites were descendants of one of Abraham's sons with Keturah after Sarah had died. Ishmael was actually, of course, the son of Hagar, who was the older brother of Isaac, and yet they're grouped together here as a people group. You have the Ishmaelites, and it could be just a generic term, and then you have the Midianites as well. But those terms are used interchangeably, and so there's consistency there between what you see in Genesis 37 and what you see here in this text as well. What's interesting, to me anyway, in light of what we know about the book of Judges and the time period, is when Gideon says, let's do this, take an earring, let's put your plunder here. And that means not only did Gideon take something of plunder, all of them did. Now, at this point, there's kind of a weaving back and forth in the narrative. We have the 300 that are with Gideon, but now it sounds like more and more of Israel is involved here. We don't know the movement of Gideon and the armies back to his hometown. We just know in the next moment he is going to be back in his hometown. But here's one thing I want you to think about in verses 25 and 26. The CSB says, we agree to give them. So they agree, which is kind of interesting. There is an irony here, given the fact that throughout the time period of the Judges, they often did not agree. And in fact, they were at war or in contention with one another often. And we even see that from battle to battle. We saw that with the Ephraimites in the middle of the battle, complaining that Gideon hadn't asked for help earlier. We see that with Deborah, where they have some of the tribes help and others don't. And we're going to see more tension and dissension and almost civil war when you look at the Jephthah narrative and Samson, and then later when you look at chapters 17 through 21, when you have just kind of a general description of what's going on in the land. They don't get along, and yet we see here they agree. The CSB says we agree to give them. The ESV says we will willingly give them. The NASB 95 says, we will surely give them. And then the NIV says, we'll be glad to give them. Isn't it interesting that when it comes to serving the Lord and working together to put out the oppressor, there are tensions? But now they may be in agreement in thinking that Gideon is taking up this plunder so as to make himself king. There are some undertones to that here. And maybe that's what they're hoping. Maybe they're hoping he's going to change his mind. But one thing is for sure, they had no problem agreeing when it came to their idol worship. And that's going to be apparent right now as we continue to read. Oh, the irony of they're willing to agree in sin, but we're not willing to agree in obedience. We're told the amount of gold was 43 pounds of gold. Many of your translations will say 1,700 shekels. We're talking about well over $1 million in our time today. I'm not going to go and figure out all the details there. You can do that. But the point is they're gathering up the plunder and they're taking that as a reward. Notice what doesn't take place after this. There is no rejoicing in the Lord. There is no giving thanks to the Lord. There is no acknowledgement of God as being their deliverer. They are going to mention Gideon as deliverer. But what we see here is Gideon taking things into his own hands and acting in many ways to receive the accolades. Well, we see all the things that they take up. We mentioned already the crescent ornaments that were around the camels' necks. There were the ear pendants, the purple garments, the chains around the necks, of course, the earrings. What happened? Gideon in verse 27 makes an ephod. Now, an ephod, you'll remember from Exodus 28, was part of the priestly garment. And it basically had a covering that went over the breastplate, had different kinds of colors in there, jewels and stones, many of those reflective of the 12 tribes. It's very ornamental, very ornamental. The thing is, though, it was designed for the priest as part of their garment. What is Gideon doing by creating an ephod? The other thing is he takes it back to his hometown. One more element of coming back where it all started. And what's interesting is he is going to then place this ephod in Ophrah, his hometown. What's going on? Well, Gideon had said he is not a king, but he's acting in some ways like a king, and he's certainly acting in some way like a priest. And so what we're seeing here is Gideon going even further away from God in any mention, and he's acting as an independent here. As a priest, perhaps, and what kind of priest? Well, if he's taking it to Ophrah, maybe he's putting this ephod over the stone where he created the altar to Yahweh, because he said, the Lord is going to be your king. And maybe he thinks that by doing this, he is going to in some way honor God. Who knows? That text doesn't say it. The other thing we're going to see in a moment is that this could be a sign of what Gideon is doing with regard to seeking out God's will. One author has said that the ephod could have seemed like some form of item in which they could then get God's will from it. Now, there's no Urim and Thummim attached to this, as there would be when the ephod is mentioned in a previous text. But some would say, well, if God is going to rule, then this might be some way to kind of divine God's will. A little bit of speculation, but there, of course, is background behind that. L. Klein, in his commentary, the triumph of irony in the book of Judges, says this, thinking about the beginning of the story and the end of the story. Gideon was clothed with Yahweh's spirit. Now he clothes himself with an idolatrous ephod. Think about the Holy Spirit enveloping him and coming over him in Romans, in Judges chapter 6, verse 34. Lawson Younger, I mentioned him earlier today, Lawson Younger, Jr., not Lawson, but Lawson Younger, says that there are like 6 things that were wrong with what Gideon did with the ephod. I will just read them quickly. I will not comment on them. But the point is, Gideon does something in doing it, and for the possible reasons that he does it, that make these wrong. 1, Gideon has no business creating an ephod. This was for the priest. Gideon was not a priest. He was from the tribe of Manasseh. He was not a Levite. So he does something only the priests were allowed to do. Real quick aside, I'll just mention this. You remember when Samuel confronted Saul in battle? Saul started doing things that only Samuel could do as the priest and the judge. And when Samuel showed up, Saul tried to act like he was doing the pious thing, doing the right thing. And Samuel says, no, that wasn't your place to do that. We see Gideon doing the same thing. He's doing something he's not allowed to do. It's not something that's in his job description, so to speak. Second, he makes Ophrah a place of worship. Now, the altar for Yahweh is built in Ophrah. That wasn't the standard place of worship for God during this time period. You know of Shiloh. And there was one place that's going to be prominent when we look at when you look later at the book of Samuel, where Eli and Samuel would serve. But what he's doing here is he's creating a different worship center. It may not be the biggest thing, but considering it took place in his hometown, what happens next, of course, is going to be key as to what might have happened here. Number 3, Gideon makes the ephod on the basis of faulty human logic. We mentioned this a moment ago. It could be that he's assuming that it could be used to inquire of God if Yahweh is going to rule. So if anything, what's he doing? If he is acknowledging God's going to rule, he's now instituting an incorrect way of seeking out God. Isn't that ironic that when he was seeking God's will or understanding God's promises earlier, he asked the angel of the Lord for a sign. Then he put out the fleece twice and asked God to do with it what he will, so as to get affirmation. And now it's quite possible this ephod is going to be some divining device to understand what God would want. He's still acting as if he's living out his old religion, but we're back kind of where we started. Number 4, and this is what is going to be stated, the ephod became a snare or a trap to Gideon and his whole household, something that ensnared him, but also something that ensnared the people. We'll talk about that in a second. Number 5, Gideon's sin in creating the ephod will eventually cause the others to sin. They follow along. Number 6, the Ephod cult, or the use of the ephod in worship, prepared the Israelites for a rapid return to the worship of Baal. Whatever the original intent, what's interesting is Israel did not respond properly. What they did is they gave everything to Gideon, and he fashioned this ephod, just like you'll remember that when Moses was on the mountain in Mount Sinai, Aaron is leading the people down below, and they gather up all of this gold and they melt it down and create a golden calf. You're seeing Israelites repeat the same kinds of actions. They're following a leader that is eventually going to take them away from worshiping God. Notice the language that's here. Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it, and it became a snare to Gideon and his household. Notice the language from 2 other verses in the beginning of the book of Judges. The idea of prostituting themselves is in Judges chapter 2, verse 17, when going through the cycle, that this is what they did. Remember, the idea of prostituting yourself is to give yourself over to someone else. They had a relationship with Yahweh. They had a relationship with God. But when they went after other gods, they were like committing adultery. They were giving themselves over to those gods. And by prostituting themselves, what basically that meant is they were allowing themselves to be used by those gods. They were not worshiping Yahweh. They were not submitting to Yahweh. They were submitting themselves to these other gods. So this language here is very reminiscent of what we see in Judges chapter 2, verse 17. The other thing you're seeing here, one is the prostituting. The other is the use of the word snare or trap. Remember when the angel came to them at Bochim, he said that this will be a trap and a snare to you. The people that you have not taken care of, the people that you have not gotten rid of, will be a trap and a snare to you. It's the exact same language from Judges chapter 2, verse 3 that's being brought up here. It was a snare to Gideon and his household. Well, what you're seeing here then is a reference to their going into sin during the lifetime of the judge. Now, this is one of those firsts that I talked to you about. And that's why, if you were paying attention to the slide that I put up there with the cycle, is that began with sin. They were oppressed. Then they cried out for help. Then they were delivered. And of course, as we've been reading, they will eventually go into sin. And I know I just did that in the opposite direction of what you're used to. Here we see them going back into sin before Gideon dies. There's a 2-stage return to sin. One, during the lifetime of the judge, and then again after the lifetime of the judge. But this is the first time in the narrative we're told that they go back into sin while the judge is still alive. They didn't even wait for him to die. Now, part of that, a big part of that, is Gideon was leading them. There was peace, as we'll read in a moment, during the time of Gideon, but we see clearly what's developing during this time. So in his making the ephod, that contributed to it. Clearly, the mindset of the Israelites was time and time again, whether it was different tribes, there's still a consistency in their attitude. After deliverance comes and ease of life returns, they go after other gods. They're so quick to go after the other gods. Notice what we see here in chapter 8, verses 28 to 35, ending number 2, Gideon's death and the aftermath. So Midian was subdued before the Israelites, and they were no longer a threat. The land had peace for 40 years during the days of Gideon. Jerubbaal, interesting, he's receiving that name again. Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, son of Joash, went back to live at his house. Gideon had 70 sons, his own offspring, since he had many wives. His concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he named him Abimelech. Then Gideon, son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. When Gideon died, the Israelites turned and prostituted themselves by worshiping the Baals and made Baal-berith, or Baal-berith, their god. The Israelites did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hand of the enemies around them. They did not show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, for all the good he had done for Israel. Let me just step back to look at verse 35 first, and then we'll go back through the other part of the text. It's interesting that there's still acknowledgement that what Gideon did was good in the grand scheme. He helped bring deliverance of the people out of the hands of the Midianites, and yet they were not good to him. The other things to look at real quickly is that we do see acknowledgement that there was the subjugation of the Midianites, and they were no longer a threat. We don't hear from them again. We do have that standard formula of there being peace for 40 years. And of course, Gideon is living during all that time. And we see all these other things we've been talking about taking place as well. He went back home, it says, and that town was Ophrah. We've seen that mentioned already. What happens is then Gideon goes on and lives his life. He marries many women, has many children. He does have a concubine in Shechem, south of where he was from. And his name, the child's name, was Abimelech. This is the author hinting at something. If we're reading along and we don't know what's coming next, you wonder, why is Abimelech mentioned by name when the other 70 sons were not? And it could be 71 if you think about Jether. And so obviously the reference to the 70 sons is throughout the lifetime of Gideon, not just after he went home after the battle. But why is Abimelech mentioned by name? That's your author's way of saying, keep reading. And of course, we're going to stop at the end of chapter 8, but the beginning of chapter 9 picks up the narrative of Abimelech. Interestingly enough, Abimelech means my father is king. Think about the irony in that. Gideon refuses to be called a king, even says his own son will not be king, nor his grandsons, and yet he names his child, the child of a concubine, not even a child of one of his many wives. My father is king. There's the irony there. He names him Abimelech. Well, it's told that he dies at a good old age and is buried in the tomb of his father. That sounds like king language also. Remember that he rested with his fathers, you'll see in the book of Kings and the books of Chronicles. And then we see what happens. After Gideon dies, the Israelites turn and prostitute themselves by worshiping the Baals, and they go and they worship and they follow a god named Baal-berith, which means something literally like this: the Baal of the covenant, or the Lord of the covenant. Baal means Lord or master, okay, in the Canaanite language. So it's either the covenant of Baal or the Baal or the Baal of the covenant. All that's being said here, though, of course, is they are now making covenant with Baal again, after all that God has done to deliver them. And here the narrator affirms that it's God that brings them deliverance by the hand of Gideon. There is that acknowledgement by the narrator. There's not that acknowledgement by Gideon in the narrative. But what gets even worse is the fact that in addition to the statement about them going after Baal, the flip side of that, of course, is they did not remember the Lord their God. And we said several lessons ago that remember is the idea of taking note of, and not just that they forgot and that it was something in the past. It was a decision of their will not to keep God in their minds. They did not remember the Lord their God. They failed to show kindness. Some concluding thoughts. These are some thoughts that I have for sure. Something like this: when you get to the end of the story, you might rightly ask, what just happened? What happened here? We see Gideon going from this shy, self-deprecating, seemingly insecure and inadequate person to being obedient to God, to going too far in many respects, to leading the people astray. The one who brought them deliverance from the Midianite coalition because of their following after Baal changes from worshiping Baal to worshiping Yahweh, delivers the people to now they're worshiping Baal again. You look at the story and you think, what just happened? When you think about then what are your thoughts about Gideon? I think it's important for us to speculate about this and try and wrap our minds around this. Do you think positively of Gideon? I mean, after all, he is mentioned by the writer of Hebrews in chapter 11 as one of those heroes of the faith. See that along with Jephthah and Samson that follow as well. Do you have any negative feelings? Maybe they're mixed feelings. Do you find parallels? And I made a hint of this earlier in the text. Do you find parallels between Gideon and between leaders today or leaders throughout history? One of the things we find is that there are good things that leaders do, but there are also some troubling characteristics that they carry with them. And so we have to wonder, what do we make of someone like this? And I'll say something about that before it's over. But what do we make of those same kind of parallels? Now, this is not a manual on leadership, but certainly we can look at Gideon in terms of what he emulates or what we can emulate, what we should avoid. But what you really need to be looking at is who Gideon is in his relationship with God. And then also what we need to be looking at is the people of Israel and how they would have received this text with the same understanding of what's going on in that time period. So one of the things I want you to think about, obviously parallels between Gideon and leaders today. Can you think also of the fact about this time period being morally ambiguous? These leaders, like Gideon, morally ambiguous. He's not a prototype, a good person. He is a mix, good and bad. He wavers, he waffles. He does what God wants him to do, and then he turns back and worships Baal again. There's a morally ambiguous time period here. And it goes back to what the author is going to say 4 times in the book of Judges, chapter 17 through 21. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And there may be a double entendre there. Clearly, this was written during the time of the monarchy when there was a king. But it also may say something to this effect, that even though Gideon didn't follow through in the way he should have, his words were correct. The Lord should rule over you. He is your king. But they didn't act like he was their king. One thing I'll say before I move on and forget, because I forgot something last week I'll bring up. God can use imperfect people for his purposes. And while we can look when people go through the Bible and talk about the sins of the various people that God used throughout history, it's important to note this. While God can use imperfect people, it's not an excuse for us to live in our imperfection willingly. That he can use imperfect people does not excuse our imperfections. Now, what do I mean by that? We're never going to be perfect. But at the same time, we should not be glib and brash about our sin. We don't know what finally ended with Gideon before he died. We don't know if he came to reckon with his attitude toward God before he died. Yes, God used many, many imperfect people. And while that can give us comfort to know that he can use us, it doesn't give us an excuse to live in that way. We need to be mindful of that. The authors, I think, tell us very clearly what Gideon went on to do. Real quick, before I forget the thing I forgot last week, I had mentioned to you last week that I would tell you about the numbers again of the Midianite army, because up until this point, we've said that the author hasn't told us how many were involved. But in chapter 8, verse 10, it's clear. Finally, the author tells us how many were in the Midianite army. We're told eventually that there were 15,000 that remained when Gideon caught up with Zeba and Zalmuna. But 120,000 had died from the beginning of the battle. Interesting that the author tells us in generic terms about how large the army was to show how God brought deliverance through the 300 against the Midianite coalition. We don't see that number until now. And so I know I have a propensity from time to time to say, I'll say that in a moment. And then sometimes I'll forget to say that. As well as I've got my notes in front of me and I'm trying to follow those. Sometimes it just leaves me. But I think it's very important to recognize another element of the narrative aspect of the author here. He finally tells us how big a deal it was that God took 300 men and was able to defeat. Now you may say again, God did all the work, but prior to that, he got help from the other soldiers, from the other tribes, and he got help from the Ephraimites, and that's true. But when it came time to take the last 15,000, there were still only 300 and Gideon. It still means God was working for them, even though Gideon was acting like he was working alone. A couple of other things before we finish. Are you left wondering what you should do with the Gideon narrative in general? We're obviously Gideon, but think about Gideon and the people. You might even ask something like this: am I supposed to like Gideon? Am I supposed to learn from Gideon? Or am I just supposed to dislike Gideon and avoid what he did altogether? I think I've been alluding to that all along as we work through this text. Maybe to this point of the narrative, or maybe that is the point, I should say. Let me clarify what I'm saying. This discomfort, this sick feeling, this disgust, if you will, the disappointment in Gideon and the people of Israel, maybe that's the author's point. He's describing what's taking place during the time of the judges. And while we want there to be good leadership and need there to be good leadership, we're seeing that we're seeing very imperfect people. And it gets worse. Jephthah is worse than Gideon. Samson is worse than that. Because any leader who is not God will be a mixture and a complex person. There will be imperfect. The point is that God is perfect in leading, but the people that are leading the people, they are imperfect. What light does this narrative shine on Israel in general? Think about Israel reading back the text in their own time. Why this much information about Gideon as compared to the others? One of the things we said at the beginning of our lesson on Gideon a few weeks ago was that when we look at Gideon, we have a lot of front story. We have a lot of personal story about Gideon. And now after the battle, well, there's a lot of information about the battle itself. But then also there is a lot of story after the deliverance. Excuse me. We don't see that with the others. What's going on here? What is there to be taken from this? What I want you to do is, now that we've studied all the parts in detail, is go back and read chapters 6 through 8 in their entirety and watch this develop. We've taken it slowly, and it did take time in the course of Gideon's life. But if you actually read those 3 chapters in their entirety, it can go quickly and you may miss something. But now that you've gone over it in detail, go back and think of all the things as they've been developing and note what God is doing here. One last thing to say. We've talked about some firsts here. There's also a last. When it says that there was peace in the land for 40 years, that's the last time there's any reference to peace among the Israelites. We won't see it after Abimelech, who's not really a judge. We are not going to see it after Jephthah. We're not going to see it after Samson. It'll talk about how long they ruled, how long they judged, but it won't mention anything about peace. It's a sobering statement. Gideon is a pivotal narrative in the book of Judges, and I think it's important to read there all that Gideon does in the way you want to like him, and also in the ways you want to be and need to be disappointed by him. There's a lot more that we can talk about. I won't keep going. I think you want to continue to ponder Gideon and think about other things that can be said on your own. And then again, always look in the mirror at ourselves. Let's pray, and then we'll talk about next week's lesson as we wrap up our study of the book of Judges for this summer. Father, we thank you for your word. As we've said in previous lessons, there are a lot of things that are troubling for us to read, and we struggle to know what it is you're trying to teach us. And maybe this moral ambiguity or this moral conflict, seeing people that you're using not often obeying you and living loyal to you, and how quickly the people in general were to turn away. Thank you for your Holy Spirit that you give us to indwell us, that convicts us of sin. Thank you for the work of Jesus on the cross, who brings us in the right relationship with you by faith in his work for us. We do pray that you will work in us daily. We know that we are a work in progress. And while we look at Gideon and the Israelites and all of their problems, we know there are times when we are disappointing to you in the sense that we still fail you. And we're just thankful that we cannot be separated from you because of what Jesus did. Pray that we will live daily, growing closer to you because we know that you hold us. Pray that you help us to seek your word daily, to know how you would have us live in relationship with you. And Lord, just give us wisdom as we read your word to know all that you want us to take from the text. Thank you that you have communicated to us through your word, that we have it preserved for us. And of course, we thank you most of all for the incarnate word, Jesus Christ, who fully explains you. May we live daily through your spirit. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, next week, we're going to conclude our look at the book of Judges, and we're going to offer a summary of the text in general. And then we're going to look at some more application of the text in general. The lesson is going to be titled, I'll give you the title now, I'll put up the screen, Lessons Learned from Judges and the Last Judge. Let's go ahead and look quickly at that. You see, let me get there. First, my quick commercial for Dr. Claude Mariottini and his blog on Gideon. This will be the last time we put that up there. There are a number of lessons that he puts. Remember, I mentioned 4 sermons that you can watch from that website, but also I think he has 7 lessons on Gideon as well. And I think you'll learn a lot from him as you do that. Very, very wise, solid professor of the Old Testament. Our lesson next week, as we said, lessons learned from Judges and the Last Judge. So what we're going to do is kind of do a quick overview of chapters 2 through 8. I know we've done that in long form, but we'll do it in short form. And there are some things that we can learn from the text as we look at a summary. And I said there's a point for us to go back and look at an application overall. And then we'll look at Samuel, the final judge. We'll take a quick look at 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 through 11. So as we get ready to go, I hope that you've learned a lot from Gideon. Hope you'll continue to go back and look at the life of Gideon. Go back and read the rest of the story. There is the son, Abimelech, and what takes place in Israel. There is Jephthah and Samson to follow. Read through the rest of Judges. It will bother you, and it should. But I think it's important that we see what Romans 1 says about humanity when it turns its back on God. And we see that here in the life of Israel, God's own covenant people. One last thing I'll leave you with before we talk about this next week, and that is you can see God extending grace, and continuing to extend grace through the book of Judges. If there's one lesson to be learned, it's that God is gracious. He is faithful to his people in covenant and desires them to be faithful as well, and has done many, many things to keep them in relationship with him. This is a tragedy, a very, very tragic book. And I think it's important that we look at that as we then see how not to live in relationship with God. Well, I don't want to leave you on a terrible negative note like that. I do hope that you will be blessed this week. I pray that you will seek to worship God fully in spirit and in truth, and that each day you'll be led by his spirit in order to fulfill his purposes in your life. So until next lesson, I pray that you will be well and that you'll be blessed.